Very long history of being an expert on every dimension of railways. London, international, he's a real historian, and he's going to talk to us today about setting up the railways in France after D-Day, which doesn't seem to be that different from setting up the railways after the Tory government. And I'm sure he's got much to say about that too. So let me hand over to Christian.
Thank you very much. The law of sod applies, of course, to this. I mean, we arranged. Oh yes, yes. It helps to have the microphone. There we are. Yes, the law of sod certainly applies. We arranged this weeks or months ago, and was, the perfect date, absolutely no problem. And of course, it's just the date on which Labour decides to announce its plans for renationalising the railway, something that I feel very strongly about, and I've been partly involved in helping them sort their plans out, and also I have written vast numbers of books about the subject. But anyway, I'm here, and you have my undivided attention for the next hour or so. I'd be very grateful if you buy some of my books afterwards, because I don't have to carry them home, although I only live 300 yards away, so it's not that difficult. So it was all kind of perfect, and I was going to be relaxed, a cup of tea afterwards, so it's going to be slightly rushed afterwards, but I certainly want to take you through this book, because it's the book that I've been most invested in. I've written a lot of other books. I've written, for you, those of you who don't know me, I've written books on the London Underground, on Britain's railways, on Indian railways, on the Trans-Siberian, on British Rail, on the mainline stations, Cathedrals of Steam, and also policy books. Like I wrote a book called Are Trams Socialist? The answer is no, but you have to read it to find out why. And driverless cars, I'm obsessed with the driverless cars Ponzi scheme, and I've written a book about that as well. But anyway, I don't want to talk about any of that. I don't want to talk about rail renationalisation. No, I'll allow one question at the end afterwards, but otherwise I want to focus on this book. This book has really been a labour of love, and when I call it the last untold story of the Normandy landings, a subtitle which was given to me by a general who goes by the wonderful name of Mungo Melvin. Only generals can be called Mungo, surely. He was a very nice chap, but he suggested that, and it really is the last untold story of the Normandy landings. The American edition, and this is American edition, which is published by a different publisher. They insisted on it being called The Untold Story of How American Engineering and Ingenuity Won World War II, which says more about American insecurity and concerns than what my book says. So what I'll cover with this book is, it looks like a lot, but there's so many stories in this book. And really it is about a bunch of very brave men, and they were all men before you start kind of trying to Me Too me now, whose achievements really have just not been recognised. And they carried out a very important, indeed I would argue vital and decisive role in the war. And yet nobody's ever written a book about them. Nobody has ever even mentioned them in all the kind of well-known books about D-Day, written by people like Hastings or Anthony Beevor or whatever. You look up railways in the index, and there's kind of one mention of possibly, some railway station that's been bombed or something. There'd be nothing about these people at all. So I just wanted to tell you how I fell into this story. I wrote a book called Engines of War, which it's a book I'm most proud about, actually, because it really sets out a different view of the relationship between the railways and war. The conventional view is that the railways, everybody gets on the railways to go to the war, they fight and they kind of come back again, or don't, as the case may be. But actually there's a symbiotic relationship between railways and war, and that's best expressed by the difference between the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which lasted for a few hours, and the Battle of Verdun, which lasted most of 1916. And the reason why the Western Front got stuck and was able to be, did not move for so long, was because the railways were feeding both sides with endless amounts of men and material, which in the Waterloo, Battle of Waterloo, you had horses doing that, and horses are very inefficient and require feeding and whatever, and they can't sustain kind of a battle of attrition like that. And what's interesting, this is a diversion which I won't go into great detail of, but very interestingly, the Ukraine war is stuck as well. And the Ukraine war is stuck in very much the way that the First World War is stuck. And now the technology that's made them stuck is drones. I had a long talk with some Royal Engineers recently about how drones have actually kind of paralysed the front. Another story, but a fascinating one, the relationship between technology and war. But so the picture on the left there actually shows the landing craft delivering material right to the front on railway tracks. And this was actually, I later found out, I didn't know much about this. I just used that picture in one of my books. And my agent said, I'm really interested in that picture. What exactly is happening? You know, what's going on there? And through researching this book, I found that actually they devised a method by which you could deliver railway equipment right onto tracks, right on the beaches, kind of obviating the need to, you know, haul it over the quays or whatever, and greatly increasing the amount of supplies that could be delivered at one point. So anyway, that was one picture my agent was interested in. And then I got an email. It's very lucky I'm called Christian Womar, not John Smith, because there's no other Christian Womar. And so Google Alert picks up anything that has my name in it anywhere in the world. And fortunately, this article fell into my lap, which was written by a completely obscure American magazine. And it tells a story, which I will relate in a minute, about how a particular railway line in France between Avranches and Le Mans was rebuilt in 3 days by General Patton's troops to enable the invasion to continue through to Paris, and he demanded this. I'll explain that story in a minute. But the combination of these two things, my agent kind of said, well, this is a very interesting story, and I said, well, I just got this email about this, and led me to start researching this story, and finding that there was an amazingly rich and important story that hadn't been told. And just if you look at some numbers, that's fairly extraordinary. You know, that so much tonnage was taken by the railways, you know, that 2,000 locomotives were taken over the channel, that involved something like 50,000 men. Now, after D-Day and whatever, it was about 1.2 million men kind of came across on D-Day and the days afterwards, or weeks afterwards. But 50,000 is quite a lot. And most of those are American, about 35, 40,000 American, about 10,000 British. I've never been able to find out precisely how many Brits were involved in railway reconstruction. But these are 50,000 people involved in railway reconstruction whose story had been kind of forgotten and whose role had been forgotten. But again, all the rest of those statistics are fairly amazing. You know, they rebuilt some 9,000 miles of railway in France and later Belgium and Holland. So first of all, why did they need to do that? They needed to do that because the railways were blown up. The railways had been destroyed, partly by sabotage from the French resistance. And as that kind of post on the left shows, it was not. There is this kind of myth that every Frenchman and Frenchwoman was, you know, in the resistance, kind of blowing things up and protesting or whatever. Of course, that's not true. In fact, in my book, I quote a statistic where one of the Resistance reckons that 10% of people were in the resistance, 10% of people were pro-German, and 80% of people just tried to get on with their lives. I think that's probably a bit pessimistic, but nevertheless, there was a lot of sabotage with very deadly results, lots of reprisals as a result of that. And there was certainly an undertaking towards the end of 43 and the beginnings of 44 that this was coordinated from the UK, and that it would play, the sabotage of the railways would play an important role in ensuring that German troops could not kind of move around northern France to reinforce their forces against the invading troops. So that was part of why the railways were wrecked. The other part was, there was this amazing guy called Solly Zuckerman who devised what was called the transportation plan, which was nothing of the sort. It was a kind of anti-transportation plan. It was basically, let's blow up as many railways as possible from the air with the Allied bombers. And that was very controversial because railway stations and junctions and yards tend to be in the middle of cities, and therefore there's bound to be what in modern times is called collateral damage, right? So there was a big debate, which I look at in the early chapter of my book, about how much should we do this? Is this something that should be done, or are we going to risk having the railway system functioning and able to bring troops? Because remember, you have to always remember this, when you embark on a war, you don't know whether you're going to win or not. And when you embark on an invasion like D-Day, you don't know that you're actually going to be hold that territory. There were very great fears that the invasion would be reversed. I mean, Eisenhower actually wrote a letter which he kept on him. He was the supreme commander, and he kept the letter on him which said, the invasion has been repulsed. I'm very sorry, this was my responsibility. I regret that these decisions were made, but they were made in good faith, or whatever, something like that. And he carried this letter with him all the time in the early days of the invasion, because there was a risk of failure. So they actually, after much debate, they blew up the railways to a great extent, creating amazing devastation to railway yards, really throughout northern France and Belgium and beyond. And so much so that, that's the railways on the left in 1936, and that's what they reckon the state of the railways were on June the 6th, 1944, thanks to a combination of Allied bombing and sabotage. There's a big debate about which was more important and which was more effective, and some of that is addressed in my book, but there's a kind of there's scope for a lot more discussion about that. So right from the start, the planning of Operation Overlord, which was the invasion plan, right from the start, they realised that the railways were going to be very important. And so they started bringing over men and equipment right from the beginning. And then on the left is one of those landing crafts where they had this kind of flexible bit of rail that kind of enabled them only at high tide. So there was a problem about you could only had about 45 minutes to an hour every day to do this. But it did save a vast amount of time. It was invented by a guy called Bingham, who later ran the New York subway. Lots and lots of material was brought right from the beginning and stored on the beaches. And the problem was that right in the initial period, the invasion was confined to an area called the Logement. which was quite small. There were the beaches around Bayeux and whatever, and there was the Cotentin Peninsula, which is where Cherbourg is, which did get taken reasonably quickly, but Caen was a great source of resistance to the Germans, and so there was quite a small area, but nevertheless, right from the beginning, they were reconnoitring the railway lines. There were guys, in the book I describe a guy called Harvey, who actually arrived about a week after D-Day, and he's immediately walking up with just one technician, and he's walking up these railways, checking what the conditions are, checking for booby traps, having shells flying over him, getting shot at, and all this kind, using these funny little jeeps, which whose wheels were specially fitted so that they could drive along tracks. And so the importance of the railways was recognised right from the beginning. So this is the area that was initially taken after a couple of weeks. These are where the beaches are, and the British arrived, the Royal Engineers arrived, and they dealt with the area, that part of the railways, and the Americans dealt with that. And the first little line that was open was that little branch line, and that was the situation until there was a breakout at Saint-Lô late in July. So essentially, we only had this sort of area, and so there wasn't much scope for using the railways, but nevertheless they were repairing them and getting them ready for further advance. And Cherbourg quickly became the most important import point, and they greatly expanded the facilities there. So before the war, they could deal with about 3,000 or 4,000 tons a day, and they increased it to around 20,000 tons. So it was like really where all the kind of material came in, and 2/3 of that was taken on by rail. Only a third was taken by truck. And this is Saint-Lô, where there was the breakout. And I think this photograph, this wonderful photograph, a lot of these photographs, they're from my book, and they were taken by a guy called Ralph Morse, who was a Life magazine photographer, which is why they're so bloody good. And the amazing photographs like this, which shows, you know, the town might have been totally wrecked, but boy, they wanted the railways to keep operating. And so they actually started the first little railway service from Cherbourg to Caen, which is about 40 miles, as a passenger service with 4 trains per day, and with freight also being carried. And they very proudly, they even produced a little leaflet saying, you know, railway service and so on, and you know, it was all done by kind of people who had worked on the railways in America. And then we get the exciting bit. We get General Patton arriving. General Patton is probably the most famous general of the Second World War. Certainly in America he is, and he is intent on the fact that armies have to be on the move. You must. He doesn't like the idea of a static army. He's a cavalry man. You can see he's wearing breeches, which he always used to wear. Amazingly hard man. He'd served in North Africa and in Italy, and famously got reprimanded for once slapping a soldier who was in a hospital suffering clearly from what we know now as PTSD, and Patton called him a coward, and he nearly got decommissioned as a result of that, but Eisenhower liked him and put him in charge of this Third Army. So the First Army had already arrived. I don't know what happened to the Second Army. But anyway, Third Army was going to lead the kind of forces through Europe, and then he came up against a problem, which is the story at the core and heart of my book, but by no means the only story. It's a couple of chapters, but it is an amazing story, which is that Patton suddenly he wants to. His troops have reached Le Mans, but they've rather overstretched their supply line, and the roads are kind of completely hopeless. And then he issues this extraordinary order that he needs 30, sometimes 31 trains to Le Mans within, the line needs to be opened within 72 hours, and then they need to send a train every half an hour to get the material through. And the main line, which goes through Pont-en-Bord, down here and then through Laval, is broken in two places. There's bridges that are just too big to repair quickly. So he asked this guy, Itzler, who's head of the what's called ADSEC, which was the Advanced kind of Communications body core, to investigate how to reopen this line, how to get these 30 trains, which are basically, you'd think it was ammunition, but it really wasn't. Most of it was actually what's called POL, petrol, oil, and lubricants. And Itzler devises a route that goes through tiny little lines that had really been built in the 1870s as kind of rural tracks. And then now I went there 2 years ago and went along. They're all cycle routes now. They're fabulous cycle routes, actually. Any of you cycle, want a cycling holiday, absolutely fabulous. And all the stations still have the station names on them and stuff, which I've only just rediscovered the pictures, so unfortunately I didn't get time to put them in here, but I do actually have some pictures. So they devised a route like this, and it was 135 miles long, to rebuild it in 3 days. And there were bomb craters, there was some little bridges out, there was all sorts of damage. 135 miles happens to be the exact distance of HS2. Which has taken rather longer than 3 days to get together. So I can't resist that one. So they actually redeployed 10,000 men. 10,000 men. I mean, no, I can't find, and maybe I stand to be corrected by the Beavers and Hastings of this world who know a lot more about military history than I do. But General Mungo supported me. I can't think of any other engineering task in World War II that required 10,000 men. I mean, and they had about 2,000 or 3,000 there already, and then they just got everybody who was in there, who had kind of landed to start rebuilding the railways, often from scratch in the way that I show here. They had presently kind of brought across a lot of supplies, but sometimes they just ripped up other railways and kind of used it. There was no signaling equipment, there was no kind of really way of communicating with these people other than jeeps running between the different work sites. And they worked effectively night and day to rebuild it. And one of the most difficult task was this bridge at Coutances, where you can see the Bailey Bridge bit kind of that got added. And there's a fantastic kind of description in my book, which they say that the guys rebuilding this saw the troops on that other bridge, which is a road bridge which had been left intact, moving forward. And they were the troops who were the combat troops. And the engineers were working on this, and the two kind of saw each other and understood the importance of their respective tasks. So the idea that there is this terrible idea in a lot of war writing that the only people who count are the people at the front line. And so this was a lovely moment, and I was very glad I managed to find this picture that kind of demonstrates how they recognized each other's importance. So they completed their line, they got there. When they turn up at Le Mans station, the station master kind of doesn't understand how they managed to get there. He said, "Oh, you've come by Laval." He said, "No, we haven't come by Laval. We've come a different way." He said, "But you can't have done that, it's impossible, c'est impossible, you know. And it kind of stands there, kind of, you know, saying, oh, well, you have to fill these papers in. And the American kind of colonel driving the train said, no, we don't. We've got 30 more trains coming, you've got to sort it out. Apparently the French guy describing this says the station master just went into the signal box and kind of hid there for the rest of the time because he was so completely bemused as to how they managed to do this. So Carl was that the different route into a deeper France, a more northern route, which was largely in the hands of the British, who had a huge rebuilding bridge. Carl was a big battle and had a huge rebuilding task, and was you know, in a devastated state. And they rebuilt it. There were some casualties there from friendly fire that killed some of the British railway troops. But they managed to get the line open, and they started building the line towards the Seine, which was the next. These guys are actually Canadian, but they've got a very Scottish name of their regiment, oddly enough, so they always had some sort of connection. But so Caen was a very important railway hub and transport hub. So then we get the advance. So after being stuck in the logement for until July the 25th, I think it was, so 6-7 weeks, they're stuck in the logement, and suddenly it opens up, pattern charges through, and they rush towards the Seine, which is the next obstacle. All the bridges on the Seine are actually down, apart from the ones in Paris itself. But they suddenly start advancing very quickly, and backed by railways behind them, which is very important. So the British are kind of operating more to the north, rebuilding railways, and the Americans to the south of this bit. And there's an amazing story I told in Dreux, where they're rebuilding the railway, and the American troops are working with French workers, and one of the French workers suddenly drops dead, having been shot in the neck, and the troops all rush out into the bush to kind of find out who's shot them. And this guy describing it suddenly hears this terrible gurgling noise, and he rushes over to his mate, and he sees that he's killed the sniper with a bayonet. You know, so because I don't quite know why it was a bayonet. Maybe they didn't have ammunition in their guns or whatever. But I mean, quite extraordinary. It was just show the extent to which these railway troops, who are really mostly railway men who had been kind of then brought into regiments and conscripted, it shows the extent to which they were quite often the front line. So they got rather stuck because they'd advanced so far, and they tried to see if you could do it by truck. And so there's a very famous initiative called the Red Ball Express, where they used trucks and they used about 50,000 trucks. They kind of commandeered trucks from everywhere, and they ran this kind of one-way system. So they ran in an eastward direction in the north, and then came back westwards in the south. And it was an idea that they wanted some 20,000 tons of supplies daily to advance towards Paris, and the railways were not yet ready, so they tried to do it by truck. And it was a major kind of operation. And it's interesting for two reasons. One is it's often more famous than the efforts of the railways. And there was a film called Red Ball Express in 1950s, which had Sidney Poitier in one of the roles. It was mainly black drivers who were working on this, and it was very much put together quickly. But the other interesting aspect is that it showed that it was not feasible to use trucks alone to try to keep the supply lines open. So they then kind of redoubled their efforts to patch up the railways. They got to Paris as Patton had promised by the end of August, which was pretty amazing. And by now they were ahead of the schedule set out in Overlord. They had initially been behind in the schedule, and suddenly they got a couple of hundred days ahead of the schedule. They were really ahead of themselves. And then they hit upon a problem that they ran out of people to run it, so they kind of advertised for more railway people to come over, and they simply ran out of being able to repair the line of communication quickly enough. So they got to eastern France very quickly. So they all this area they kind of conquered very quickly, and they get to Liège virtually on the edge of the German border. They get to Metz, they get to Verdun, Metz, Nancy. They get to all these places by sort of end of September, October. They really overrun the whole of France, but then they get stuck. And they get stuck because the railways, they haven't got enough railway support. And they admit this. I quote some kind of army reports in this, that the reason they stopped was because of the railways had been destroyed. I just happen to love this picture because it shows both the chaos and how people kind of improvised by using the bridges that had been repaired hastily, and they haven't even got time to clear off the destroyed wagons, and the pretty mesdemoiselles, as the French, the American reports keep on calling them, bicycling mesdemoiselles, and this just shows the extent to which the damage was kind of so comprehensive, and the Germans delighted in kind of destroying facilities. If they had time to, they would destroy the facilities before leaving. And they had this amazing, I'm not going to try and pronounce the German, my French is very good, but my German is non-existent. So, but it was basically, that big hook was kind of towed behind a flat wagon and a locomotive, and ripped up all the sleepers, and then they used explosives to blow up the rails, and so it basically caused as much damage as feasible very quickly. And luckily they didn't use that in Normandy, but they did use it in eastern France, where they had more time to retreat. And then there is this forgotten bit of there's another forgotten bit. I mean, I only knew of this because I used to spend my childhood summers in the south of France, and there's lots of memorials to the troops that landed there, but they landed in places like Antibes and Cannes and Gulf and Jean-les-Pins, the places that are kind of the Côte d'Azur was actually a battleground initially, and they made very quick progress through, but there was this whole second invasion. Started in the middle of August the 15th, which those of you who know France will know that is a holiday in France, the 15 août. And they, so there was literally, it wasn't on the scale of D-Day, but it was very important, but it's largely been forgotten. And again, they had a kind of logement area conquered very quickly, but they soon got to Marseille, Aix, and then they started working up the Rhône, repairing railways as they went along. And they actually underestimated the importance of the railways because they didn't send over the railway battalions amongst the first troops. And then they realised, we need these guys to repair the railways, and they started then sending them across. And they did kind of sterling work on all sorts of parts of the railway network, and eventually teamed up with the troops in the north. And then we've got kind of conquered Liège, not Antwerp, which comes later. Liège becomes the big supply depot for the push into Germany. And so much so, there's kind of trains backing up, the kind of 20 miles long traffic jam of trains, because Liège as you might know, is in a sort of valley and a bit of a natural bottleneck. I couldn't find a more modern picture of the station. Antwerp was one of the big mistakes of the Second World War, in that Antwerp falls to a combination of Belgian resistance and some British troops. The town itself falls at the beginning of November. But Montgomery is more intent on, the beginning of October. Montgomery is more intent on Operation Market Garden, which is the attack at Arnhem, where they send lots of parachutists behind the lines and so on, and ignores Antwerp has this, this is 70 miles long, the Scheldt, which is the very navigable estuary into Antwerp. Antwerp is by far the biggest port in Northern Europe. Rotterdam has been somewhat wrecked by the war, so Antwerp is an absolutely key place. But they can't open it up for about 6 weeks because they have to take the Scheldt. And the Germans, who've abandoned Antwerp rather hastily, then realise that this is absolutely vital to kind of stop the troops going, to stop the supplies getting through at Antwerp, kind of put up a big fight over the Scheldt and the Canadian troops, and then almost sacrificed to go and take it over. A horrible part of the war, really bloody part of the war, fighting in marshes and so on. Eventually they kind of get to Antwerp, which then becomes the absolutely key hub. And the Germans kind of realised that by losing Liège and losing Antwerp, they've enabled the Allies to build up forces for the invasion of Germany. So they've made this kind of mistake, and then they try and stop it through the use of these horrendous weapons. The V1 is kind of really just a sort of, they were called doodlebugs, they're just a kind of shell, really, that is fueled and then it just drops down when it runs out of fuel. The V2 is much more sophisticated and is a rocket. And literally, Liège and Antwerp kind of face these attacks for weeks on end. At one point in Antwerp, they're getting a V2 every 10 minutes for a couple of days. I mean, it's just unbearable. And it puts a lot of pressure on the troops because you never know where these things are going to land. And I remember my mother talking to me about, she lived in Chiswick, and one of the first doodlebugs ended there, and she talked about how how it was when it stopped kind of the engine, then you kind of took cover and stuff. And then we get a surprising aspect, which is the German counter-offensive. Big mistake on the whole, because they didn't really have the forces, but they managed to create this salient about 50 kilometers. So they managed to take back some land, they managed to take back some parts of the railway. The railway troops work really hard to reinforce the different parts, so they have to abandon some railways and create new railheads and basically move a lot of supplies around behind the lines, and managed to do so. The offensive peters out, starts on the 16th of December, peters out just a couple of days after Christmas Day, really, but nevertheless causes a lot of damage and problems for the troops. Delays the invasion into Germany, which had been scheduled for the 19th of December. Patton was all excited about that, and then because he's very adaptable, he manages to move his troops around and so on, and they managed to stop the advance. Again, railways play a very big role in this, because the British bombed the German railways and stopped them from reinforcing the support. So we get over into Germany, we begin to move forward quite fast, and then there is the obstacle of the Rhine, which was always going to be the kind of a big barrier to getting into Germany. Historically had been the big barrier to resist the attacks of invaders from the west. And very fortunately they find this bridge which the Germans tried to blow up, is left in a damaged state but usable, and so they managed to get about 10 days use of the bridge, and then it collapses. And Itchner describes this, about how he had tried to warn them that the bridge was not in a usable state, and he felt very guilty that he didn't manage to persuade them, and because 38 people died when it plunges into the Rhine. And then they have to build new bridges across the Rhine, of which they build three. One of them, the British, which is seen as the greatest achievement, engineering achievement that the British carried out. Once we get across the Rhine, essentially the war is won, and we take the Ruhr. Once the Ruhr falls, the Germans can no longer re-equip themselves. And it finishes quite quickly. May the 8th, 1945 is VE Day, and victory is ours. And so I just take you through a couple of other aspects about the use of the railways, which again are kind of forgotten about. There were 50 ambulance trains. These took about 370, I think, maximum patients, depending quite on how bad they were and whatever. But they moved 200,000 men back to the ports by the end of 1944. I couldn't get statistics after that, but that's just extraordinary. Just the numbers are kind of amazing. Ambulance trains got some sort of priority. You couldn't drive an ambulance more than 25 miles. That was the limit that the military set, but also out of common sense, partly because the roads lousy. Remember, this is an era before bypasses and before autoroute or whatever. I mean, the roads are pretty basic, and they're jam-packed with military. So the ambulance trains were really the only way you could get people out. Trains were used to carry prisoners around. They will look rather jolly in this, actually. But, they are prisoners, so they're probably pleased to see that they're not having to fight anymore. And they even used the trains for worship, and they had these kind of mobile wagons which they used, which, interestingly enough, I describe at quite length in my book on the Trans-Siberian Railway, where they also kind of had kind of chapel cars, as it were. And they weren't all goodies. They were not all angels, these guys. There was a lot of temptation to steal stuff. The black market prices were, extraordinary. Several $100s for, a carton of K rations, and it was a lot of money in those days, and all sorts of stuff that they were carrying was a temptation. And one of these battalions, 716th, which was sponsored by the Southern Railway in America, Southern Railroad Company. All these battalions, so about 50 American battalions, were all sponsored by a particular railway company. In the time, there were lots of railroad companies. And so this particular heist was, they would wait to get around the bend, and then the train would stop. And so the MP, the military police who was guarding it, wouldn't be able to see what was happening on the other side, and they would steal stuff. And this 716th, which consisted of 800 men, 200 men were charged with stealing stuff, including the colonel, although the colonel got off because he seemed to be so stupid. He told his men, well, you can take a little stuff, but only what you need for yourselves. Kind of. But it just goes to show that it was so important that the military saw this as so important. They locked up some of these guys for 40 years. They gave them 40-year sentences because it was seen as undermining the war effort. And some of them were allowed back in, but essentially they charged 200 out of 800 people, and all from that one battalion. And then there was a terrible train accident. This place called Saint-Valery-en-Caux, which is on the coast in Normandy. And what happened was that they had a tank regiment. They were very anxious to get this tank regiment into service, and the train was overloaded, undoubtedly. And despite a couple of warnings about by the engineer, the driver, who said, I'm not sure that the braking capacity can be enough. They started getting out of control down the hill. Saint-Valery-en-Caux is on the coast, and there was a hill that led to it, and the train got out of control. And tragically, a lot of the soldiers were sitting in open wagons, you know, the kind of freight wagons with the sliding doors. And it crashed at about 50 miles an hour into the little station at the end, and a lot of the sliding doors, I mean, you can see them there, you know, the sliding doors shut and cut off their legs or damage their legs kind of irredeemably, and they killed 89 people and injured about twice as many as that. And interesting enough, it was all hushed up. And in some of my other books, I describe other accidents in wartime, which were the worst railway accidents always happen in wartime. The British, the worst accident is Quintin's Hill, which was on the Scottish English border, where about 200 troops heading for Gallipoli were killed in a series of in a train which crashed into two other trains. Wartime is often this time of bad railway accidents. But what was terrible about this is that it was completely hushed up, and so much so that some of the servicemen who'd been injured in this, trying to get help from veterans' hospitals, couldn't get it because they said, "Oh, we've never heard of this accident. It's not true. You know, you've hurt yourself some other way." So it was, you know, it was very fortunate there weren't other. In the book, I describe various other incidents which could have been far worse. But for the courage of some railwaymen taking you know, burning wagons away from ammunition trains and all that kind of stuff. And they had a response to the Red Ball Express later in the war, in February 1945, I think. They started this service, which was a special service that went from Cherbourg all the way through to Paris, and then later on to Germany, delivering priority freight. And they had a kind of balance of what it should be called. And they called it the Tout de Suite Express on the basis of tout de suite in French. And the guys who suggested the name got a week's leave. I think they should have probably got something far worse, but anyway. And they took mail. Mail is very important. You think, you know, post isn't that important, but it is. It's very important for the morale of troops. So they took a lot of mail on this. They took a lot of other priority things. They had other trains like this. There was another train called the 3-Star Express, which was also kind of freight